Hear that? It's SpringFest savings calling your name, only at Lowe's. Right now, get a free Select Ego 56-volt battery when you buy a Select Ego trimmer, blower, or mower. Plus, get your choice of any 2 bags of Miracle-Gro organic soil mix for only $16. Shop these can't-miss deals in-store or online today. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 4/2. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. Excludes Hawaii.
Today on CityCast Pittsburgh. Since taking over in January, the new Trump administration has made immigration enforcement and deportation a big priority, even orchestrating some very scary, very high-profile arrests of university students.
Earlier this week, ICE arrested a Turkish student studying at Tufts University on a valid visa.
And now the latest on Mahmoud Khalil. He's the recent Columbia University graduate who was detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement for his role in last year's campus protests against the war in Gaza.
Today, I'm with Vanessa Stein, a senior staff attorney for the ACLU of Pennsylvania, to talk about how to try and protect yourself and your neighbors during and after an ICE encounter and what rights people have regardless of their immigration status, plus how all of us can help in the midst of all of this fear. It's Wednesday, April 2nd. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. How often did you have to talk about ICE and ICE activity before January 2025?
A lot. I mean, I think one perspective to keep in mind is certainly what is happening now is heightened, and there's been a lot more aggressive communication from the administration about ICE enforcement and all of that. But, we were still actively litigating cases under the Biden administration. We filed a civil rights administrative complaint about conditions at Moshannon Valley Processing Center with co-counsel, which that's out in Clearfield County. It's close to State College. Mm-hmm. And that facility was opened up by the Biden administration as an ICE detention facility. That's when it started. It didn't start under the first Trump administration or previous administrations. And so, I think that is one perspective to keep in mind that, yes, things are worse now in terms of immigration policy and enforcement, but there were still serious problems under the Biden administration. And even looking back further, the Obama administration had high records of removals from the United States and was quite aggressive in immigration enforcement as well. I think one issue with sort of the current regime of things is that enforcement priorities are gone, meaning ICE doesn't have directions to prioritize people for removal. And so what does that mean? It means that anybody can be prioritized for removal in ICE's eyes, and they have quotas, which means they need to try to do a certain number of arrests per week. And whenever you have that combination, it's going to lead to an uptick in racial profiling and rights violations, because they're just trying to get a certain number of people without regard to the people's personal circumstances or, community ties or any of that. And so that is something that, is particularly problematic when you have an administration who is not creating policies that create, any guardrails around people's civil rights and civil liberties.
Thinking about kind of what we've seen over here, we've seen and heard a lot the last few weeks about how ICE has started targeting our neighbors, walking into restaurants, stopping at local businesses. We've heard stories about, detaining legal residents because of the color of their skin. What have you learned, I guess, about ICE activity and how it's changed in the last few weeks? What's happening here in Pennsylvania?
I mean, I think we've heard similar things as well, including, ICE going around outside of grocery stores that are ethnic grocery stores and stopping people indiscriminately. There's been a couple of smaller arrests at different work sites where ICE is claiming that they had reports about labor exploitation, but then they're arresting the workers. And as an aside, like ICE isn't actually in charge of investigating labor violations. It's a different age, that would be the Department of Labor, for example. So
Yeah.
sometimes people are getting picked up at their ICE check-ins, so they're complying with their terms of supervision and they get picked up anyways. Sometimes people in similar circumstances aren't being picked up. And I think that sort of speaks to just ICE is just trying to get a certain number of people on certain days. And so it's just happenstance right now. There's also been an uptick in activity in and around courthouses in Pennsylvania. So there had been a Department of Homeland Security memo that largely limited courthouse arrests because the former administration recognized that when ICE arrests people in and around the courthouse, it has a real chilling effect for people's access to the courts, not just people that are facing criminal charges, but victims and witnesses. That is troubling, but not surprising. We saw that under the first Trump administration, and it's something that the ACLU of Pennsylvania and I know other organizations as well are tracking. And, we're interested in thinking about really identifying potential problematic patterns and where we can try to make a difference through litigation with some of those enforcement patterns. So that's something that we're keeping a close eye on.
Part of the reason that we were really excited to talk to you today is because, people in our community are scared. So I was hoping you might be able to walk us through what to do if you feel like you personally are being targeted by ICE, or if you just want to be a good bystander. Maybe just start with the basics. Like, what does an ICE stop or raid look like? Like, what kinds of situations, like time of day, places, like where does this stuff happen?
ICE often conducts raids and arrests early in the morning, but not always. And I'm talking about like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. Often is how early they'll go. I'll say, another challenge with ICE interactions is that ICE doesn't always wear clothing that properly identifies themselves. So they can be dressed in plain clothing and they may or may not have vests on that say ICE or police. And so it can be confusing sometimes to even know, like, who are these people and what are they doing? And in addition to that, ICE sometimes proactively engages in ruses, like especially when they stop people on the street or go to their homes, meaning like they will say that they're the police or probation and hold themselves out to be something other than who they are, which are ICE officers. And so,
is that legal? Can they do that?
Well, it's a good question. That's a practice that has been challenged in some ongoing litigation by another ACLU affiliate, ruses specifically about them pretending to be probation officers, and that case is ongoing. But
it's a wild thing to consider. Like police officers aren't even allowed to hide in a patrol car to catch someone for speeding. Like generally in Pennsylvania, you think like, if you have a rule like that, then you wouldn't then allow agents to come in and lie to someone about who they are.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think what is hard is that there's just not been a lot of oversight or reining in of ICE practices. And so it is these sorts of common ruses. Like if they're wearing police vests and somebody just assumes they're police, they don't correct it, but they don't necessarily say who they are. And so that gets to sort of my next point generally, which is, and I'll say all of this with the caveat of like people have to decide whether or not they feel like safe and able to ask certain questions that I'm going to suggest here. Like, I'll start with like street encounters with ICE, which are ICE will often go up to people on the street and stop them and will say something like, "Hey, I'm looking for so-and-so. Like, do you know them or do they live here?" And first of all, like, a street encounter like that, people are under no obligation to stop and talk to them. And our advice is that they ask, am I free to leave? And if ICE says yes, or then they keep going, because what ends up happening is ICE uses the conversation of like, oh, this person's just trying to help me find this other person, to then start asking questions about that person's immigration status. Meaning, after they say, hey, do you know so and so? And the person says, oh, no, I've never seen them. Or, yeah, they're my neighbor. They'll say, oh, okay, well, tell me about yourself. Like, what's your name? And what's your immigration status? And they'll just pivot to that really quickly. And I think, you know, again, it's like the street encounter situation is ICE can't detain somebody unless they have a legal reason to do so. And ICE, normally, like when they do these sorts of street encounters and they arrest people afterwards, the ICE report will say this was a consensual encounter, meaning ICE is claiming like this was just a consensual conversation, the person stopped, and they willfully gave up this information, which is why, going back to my first point about street encounters with ICE, is that people should ask, am I free to leave? Because if they're free to leave, then they should just keep walking away. They don't need to speak with ICE.
Well, so that's a street encounter. What if an officer shows up at your door? What do you do then?
Yeah. I mean, if ICE shows up at somebody's door, people have heightened privacy and Fourth Amendment rights at home. And so ICE is not allowed to enter, is not supposed to enter somebody's home without a judicial warrant, meaning like a judicial search warrant or a judicial arrest warrant, which is signed by a judge, not an administrative warrant. And the difference is administrative warrants are warrants that ICE officers sign themselves. They are not reviewed by a judge to determine whether or not ICE has met the standards under the Fourth Amendment to obtain a judicial warrant. And so what does that mean? It means if ICE doesn't have a judicial warrant, you do not need to let them in your house. The only way they can get into your house is...
Do they look very different? Like, can you tell at a glance like what one is versus the other?
They do. A judicial warrant is going to say at the top, like, United States District Court, and it's going to have a signature by a judge, and it's going to list like the judge's title below the signature. So you should be able to see magistrate judge or district court judge. An administrative warrant, the caption at the top is going to say Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so people should ask, if ICE is knocking on the door, like, do you have a warrant? And if ICE says yes, to ask to see a copy, to slip it under the door, or if you can't slip it under the door, hold it up to a window so that they can look. And ICE doesn't normally have judicial warrants. And so that means, you know, people don't need to let ICE in if ICE doesn't have a judicial warrant.
Yeah. So, I mean, now you've had some kind of encounter and hopefully you know what to look for. What do you do next? Like, do you call someone for help? Do you let someone know that you've now had this encounter?
Sure. I think, you know, if somebody does have ICE come to their house and they don't have an immigration attorney, it would be good for them to try to have a consultation with an immigration attorney. Or if they have an immigration attorney, they should call them. I also know, you know, in the Pittsburgh area, Casa San Jose, which is a community organization, there has been
they do incredible work, and I know they've been so overwhelmed, but they want people to keep calling. Call them if you do need help.
Yeah, they want people to call. They want to because they're tracking locally about ICE enforcement, and so reporting to Casa San Jose about what happened as well. I think would be a good step. And then I think, you know, talking to an immigration attorney about what happened and also understanding like what your options are, meaning like if there's people in the house that don't have immigration status, knowing whether they can do anything to try to regularize their status, they can apply for anything now, or whether it would only be something that would be defensive, meaning like if they were put into removal proceedings. But just having an idea ahead of time and being able to know that ahead of time is ideal, because once somebody's in ICE detention, it can be harder to access counsel, and it can be a very like confusing and traumatic experience. And so knowing ahead of time what could be done if ICE comes back, or like if the next time they they do try to arrest the person on the street or something like that is important.
Today's episode is supported by History Unerased, a provider of LGBTQ inclusive curriculums. How would your life have changed if you'd learned about influential LGBTQ figures in school? History Unerased helps teachers tell a more complete story of our nation's history. They say they're the country's leading group when it comes to bringing LGBTQ history into schools, something that's really important at a time when LGBTQ rights are under attack. And you can support this work by showing up to Yins Can't Erase Us. History Unerased is hosting an afternoon of community and celebration on Saturday, April 5th at 5801 in Point Breeze. The party will include food, drinks, music, trivia, and a giveaway, plus an appearance from Danny Roberts from the New Orleans season of MTV's The Real World. Get your tickets on their website, it's unerased.org, and then click on the supporters tab to buy your ticket and contribute to a more inclusive future for us all.
This episode is brought to you by the Nissan Armada Pro 4X. With a twin-turbo V6 engine ready to propel your adventures, up to 8,500 pounds of towing capacity to haul all your favorite toys and space for 8 passengers, Nissan's most powerful car yet will chew up and spit out anything you throw at it. Learn more about the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada at nissanusa.com. Towing capacity varies by configuration. See Nissan Towing Guide and Owner's Manual for additional information. Always secure cargo.
It's got to be so disconcerting to know that, you know, you're on someone's list. You're on a list somewhere.
Yeah.
They could come back. We've been talking about the experience of someone who is encountering the ICE agent. You know, say you are a citizen, but you think you see ICE, you know, knocking on the door of your neighbor or talking to someone or potentially targeting someone on the sidewalk, like, you know, about to make that move. What should those folks do?
Sure. You know, in Pennsylvania, bystanders are allowed to film law enforcement, but they just need to do so in a way that doesn't interfere with the interaction. So, like, staying on public sidewalks and things like that are important to, like, in terms of recording. And again, like, if people feel safe to do that, recording incidents can be helpful. I'll just say with the one caveat of, like, if ICE is arresting people, like, and bystanders are recording that, not sharing that publicly, not sharing, like, the images of people being arrested publicly without the impacted people's consent is important, is just important from, like, a respecting people's sort of privacy and autonomy. But bystanders definitely can and should, if they feel safe, record incidents, because that can also be helpful evidence in people's cases later, especially if ICE is claiming the interaction went one way, you know, and it actually didn't go that way.
Do ICE officers wear things like body cams? Like, is there footage to check without a bystander taking that step?
There's not. Yeah, they don't use body cams. They are normally armed, even if they're in plain clothing. But yeah, they don't use body cams.
So if you think you're seeing ICE activity, how do you advise folks share the word? You know, I've heard that it can actually be really harmful when folks, you know, post a video or even just share, like, a rumor, like they think they're doing the right thing on social media. Like they just want to let people know that this is happening. But I understand that, but, like, you got to balance that with also verifying what's happening. I mean, how do you advise folks maybe make that consideration for themselves?
Yeah, I think, you know, the advice generally is not to post if it's just a rumor, like, and you're not sure, like, it hasn't been the confirmed ICE enforcement action, because that sort of dis or misinformation can be harmful. And I'll say sometimes there's, like, actually, you know, purposeful disinformation out there, meaning there's people that are, like, actively spreading misinformation to try to scare immigrant community members. But if someone is seeing something, you know, with their own eyes and they think it's ICE, but they're not able to verify it, I think contacting an organization like Casa San Jose, which does work to try to track down and confirm whether there's been ICE action in a particular place is important.
And we should say the executive director over there, Monica Ruiz, the Casa San Jose's executive director, said she's heard many reports, but every time she speaks, like I feel like folks ask her, how often is this happening? You know, do you know how many interactions or raids there have been? And every time she's just like, I cannot say with authority the difference between the rumors and the verified incident. So no, I don't have a number, but please keep calling us. Actually, if you're listening to this and you do want to make that phone call, it's 412-343-3111.
You do raise a good point too about like, there's not a lot of publicly available information about ICE enforcement. Like right now, all we have from ICE is when they make reports about particular enforcement actions, but they're not necessarily reporting every incident. Although I will say there was just some data, because there is sort of like large data that's released about enforcement generally, like not at like a city level. And my understanding is that like enforcement numbers actually aren't up so far. So like, even though there's been a lot of potential reports about enforcement, like the actual numbers, let's see here. So ICE does publish semi-monthly statistics on the total initial ICE bookings following an arrest, meaning like when they arrest somebody, like and process them. And so they're saying the numbers did initially jump in January, but then in February, daily numbers have fallen below daily arrests during the same fiscal year period under the Biden administration. So, you know, this is basically shows like there was an uptick in the initial days of the Trump presidency, but then that has decreased so far again. And there could be an increase later, but for now, it's not actually a market increase. So
let's talk about what happens when those arrests do happen, the ones that they, you know, have verified and they're tracking. Where does the government take someone who's been detained?
Yeah, so they have to process them. They'll normally process them at their local field office, which Pittsburgh has a field office. That's just like where they basically fill out some paperwork and then serve it on the person that they've arrested. And then in terms of ICE detention centers in Pennsylvania, the biggest one is Shannon Valley Processing Center, which is, I mentioned earlier, is in Clearfield County. That can detain up to 1,900 people, and it's not yet at capacity. I think there's about 1,500 people there right now. And so that's the likely place that they'll be taken.
Vanessa, that is so much bigger than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's the biggest detention center in the Northeast, unfortunately. So it's like also detaining.
And we have a
people.
lot of prisons.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if a detention happens, you know, in immigration court, you do have a right to a lawyer, but you are not provided one. It's not like criminal court where you're assigned a public defender. What do you do if you can't afford a lawyer?
I mean, technically people can represent themselves, but, you know, practically that can be really difficult because immigration law is really complex.
Yeah, you need a law library. Like the process itself is just so complicated.
Right. And there's a law library, but everything's in English. And maybe there's a few things in other languages, but it's not sufficient. I mean, it's really hard. I think practically, like most people end up giving up if they don't have attorneys. I think that's like the sad reality. And, you know, there is a program at Shannon Valley where the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center, which is a legal services organization that represents both detained and non-detained immigrants, they do a legal orientation program where they go in and they help people understand what the process is and do some like one-on-one discussions with people who are proceeding pro se to kind of help them kind of orient. But it's just really challenging. And there is like a pilot project in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Immigration and Family Unity Project, PIFUP, that does really great work in both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, fund that project. But it only has a couple of attorneys and they certainly can't help everybody who needs it. And so people are either left with having to pay for their own attorneys or tried to mount their own defense, which is just really challenging to do, especially if they remain detained.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're talking about people going to immigration court. That's really only for people that don't have old removal orders. So like, for example, if somebody was deported 10 years ago, or they were ordered removed and didn't leave, they're not going to have a court hearing. ICE is just going to use their old order of removal to deport them again. The other thing that's really concerning that we're keeping an eye out for here, and people around the country are as well, and that's something that our national office is challenging, is something called expedited removal. So expedited removal is like a fast track way to deport people with no due process, because people don't get a court hearing. And I'm talking about people that have never been ordered deported before.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about due process for citizens, there are many, many checks and balances between the point where you are maybe arrested by an officer for an offense before there's any decision made, let alone you were physically removed to another place. Like, it's kind of mind-boggling that we just skip so many steps in this moment. I guess I'm curious, if there are any other resources you recommend for folks who are hearing this and they're concerned about themselves, their friends, and their families.
We have some resources on our page. It's www.aclupa.org. I know you're right. The other thing I'll say is that if people aren't sure if they're eligible for immigration relief, which can be difficult to get under our current immigration laws. So I'm not saying that if you talk to an immigration lawyer, you're going to find out you're magically eligible for something. That's not what I mean. But sometimes people are eligible for forms of immigration relief right now, and they don't know. And so making sure that they know what their situation is and what their plan could be if they are arrested by ICE ahead of time is ideal. Because sometimes they can also organize evidence and other information that could be helpful in their deportation defense. And I think for people that are, allies and citizens who are concerned about these issues, supporting local immigrant rights organizations is really important. And so again, pointing back to sort of Casa San Jose and other organizations that might need volunteers or that might need monetary support to do the work that they're doing, and thinking about different ways that people can show up and provide support to community members who are facing a lot of harm right now.
Well, Vanessa, thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing this wealth of knowledge, and thank you for all of the many, I'm sure, unseen things you are doing behind the scenes with your legal work to protect folks there as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you got something from this episode and you have a Spanish speaker in your life who you think might want to hear it, we are dropping a condensed Spanish language version too. So please check your podcast feeds and share it with anyone who you think might benefit from hearing it. A couple more updates. Since we talked to Vanessa, ICE released more recent data. And on average, it still seems like former President Biden actually arrested and removed more people than the Trump administration has, at least so far. Meanwhile, the Republican-controlled state Senate passed a bill this week requiring prosecutors to notify ICE if they think a defendant in their case isn't a citizen. Now, this is just a bill, not a law. To pass, the state House would also have to agree, and per that special election recently, it is still controlled very narrowly by Democrats, and they have not supported this measure in the past. Plus, it would also need a signature from Governor Josh Shapiro. That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. Our producers on this episode include Mallory Falk and Adrian Gonzalez. Special thanks to Adam Demaray for translating and voicing our Spanish language version. Again, if you or anyone you know needs help or needs to report an ICE action in Pittsburgh, call Casa San Jose. They're at 412-343-3111. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. We'll talk to you then. I hear the clicking and good stuff's happening.